10 surprising things about the CSRD. Cynthia Mabry is a partner at Gibson Dunn in Houston. You'll find that she knows a lot about a stuff that sounds pretty complicated, but she makes it easy to understand today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. Cynthia, 10 surprising things regarding the CSRD. I know this is a huge new development for larger companies, both in the US and, of course, outside the US. And so thank you so much for preparing 10 surprising things, because I love this kind of a format. So what is the first surprising thing we should know about CSRD?
I'm very glad to be here. And I'll really start off kind of talking about how fluid this is in the first couple of surprising things, and really kind of how we got here, and also what's happened just in the last couple of days. So on October 18th, we had some new news that sounded really exciting about the CSRD. So I'll break that down as well. So for us, we get a lot of questions about, what do I need to do to report on CSRD? And I think the frustrating thing for us and for our clients is this is very much still a very fluid situation. And the most surprising thing I would say is, number one, is CSRD is not directly applicable law. And what I mean by that, so again, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, was adopted by the EU Parliament in November of last year, and it became effective in January. But every EU member state is given a period of 18 months to transpose the CSRD into their own laws. So that means there's going to be a French CSRD, and there's going to be a German CSRD. And this process is expected to generate additional requirements on the individual EU member state level. So I say all that because the CSRD, again, is the framework that will be adopted by each individual jurisdiction. The deadline for this is next summer, which is July 6, 2024. So kind of as a level setting, the CSRD is here, but not fully adopted, and there's definitely more to come.
Well, that sounds like it's going to be a lot of work for multinational companies that will need to comply with many different laws. The billable hour lawyer's dream.
Our nightmare.
Nightmare, yeah. Everyone is so busy. Okay, what's the second surprising thing?
So really along the same lines is there's a lot of confusion about the ESRSs. So that's the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So I say this because I think the most surprising thing is what was just adopted in July by the EU Commission is just the first ESRS. So it's the first ESRS. There's many more ESRSs and disclosure requirements to come. So similar to CSRD, having to be implemented by each individual member state. You have one ESRS. This is really the non-industry specific overarching ESRS. That's what's come out now. And then the future ESRSs are things that we don't know about. So going back to this is a fluid situation, we really just have the backbone. We don't really want to know what the arms and legs are going to look like, or the totality of what reporting is going to look like. And if you think about this as a new reporting framework, think about the 34 Act, setting the stage for the regulations underneath and how that was developed over decades. That is just what is happening now. So I mentioned that there's some new news as of October 18th. It sounded really fun in the headlines. CSRD, ESRSs are delayed. Okay, sounds exciting, really not that exciting. And why I say that is because the EFRAG, which is the, more acronyms, the group that actually goes about, so the European Financial Reporting Advisor Group goes about actually developing the ESRSs. So in yesterday's decision, so October 18th decision, the EU actually gave the EFRAG additional time to develop those second, third, fourth ESRSs, which is good in one way because it's giving them the time to digest the information, seek stakeholder feedback, allow the other reporting frameworks that are being developed across the globe, have people catch up a little bit, have them have time to evaluate the equivalence provisions, and also what will the non-US parent ESRS look like? It all sounds great. What they did not do, which is really important, is while the EFRAG has additional time to develop the additional ESRSs, the reporting timelines have not changed. So what that means is instead of seeing ESRSs come out as early as 2024, now it's 2026 when we're seeing additional ESRSs. So they have 2 more years, we don't. The non-EU parent reporting would still be expected to apply for in 2029 for fiscal years 2028. So it's just less time for us to absorb the information. And I say all that meaning like the practical implications of that is what we have right now, the ESRSs, are still unchanged. The scope is unchanged. The reporting framework is unchanged. Who it applies to is unchanged. Nothing has really changed. All the European Parliament did is give extra time to the EU entities to help this. So one other thing I would mention is this is, again, still fluid in reporting. Similar to the CSRD, the ESRSs were adopted this summer, but actually are not law yet. So they have to be published in the EU official journal, which will only happen after a 4-month period has come since they were adopted. So that's end of November, early December. There was actually a vote October 18th to withdraw the ESRS. Again, you may have seen headlines. Reuters had one about some pushback on the CSRD. That vote was voted down. So again, it's expected that the first ESRS will go into effect January 1st, 2024.
Things, yeah, the basic timeline still remains the same. What about the third most surprising thing?
So now we've gone through kind of, the legislative framework, which I think is so important to really understanding the breadth of what is being asked. Really, why it's getting so much attention is that breadth. So the CSRD reporting framework is much broader than the proposed SEC climate disclosure rules and much broader than anything else that is out there. And I think that is what's most surprising, because there are so many US companies now that have voluntarily disclosed and are following pillars of the TCFD. And that's what the CSRD is doing. It's loosely following the TCFD framework, similar to the SEC climate disclosure rules, similar to the California laws that were adopted earlier this month. But the important thing to know is a TCFD compliant report is unlikely to satisfy your CSRD reporting obligations. That is how broad it is. So to be clear, there is no directly comparable framework to the CSRD. It is materially broader than everything else out there. And that is the direct result of this double materiality analysis that is baked into every aspect of the CSRD.
Yeah, I can't, and I'm not familiar necessarily with the other areas of law to see how much, I guess privacy law was one that springs to mind where US lawyers have to work so closely with European lawyers, but this definitely is going to be an area where just like you are in your firm, working so closely hand in hand with your colleagues over in Europe.
What translate to American.
Yeah, it's tough. And with the time zone changes and just differences in culture, I know when I was in-house working for a multinational company, it can be really tough sometimes to just even coordinate meetings. What about number 4? What's the fourth surprising?
So this really goes to, who this applies to, but also how it applies. So much of what the questions relate to, are you in scope for CSRD? And that's being evaluated on what a company looks like today. So I think what you should be wary of is saying, well, I'm not a public company, I'm a private company, or I don't do business in Europe, so surely this doesn't apply to me. So I think the surprising thing is that there are indirect reporting implications related to the CSRD. So really, whether you are in scope or not, companies in the EU's value chain have an indirect reporting obligation. And this goes back to the double materiality standard, which we will not go into today, which is, hours of content by itself. But what I mean by that is, if you are an in-scope company, you are assessing your own materiality. So your impact materiality, whether, or in your financial materiality, and your various reporting obligations will be whether it's has an impact materiality or a financial materiality or both. Okay, so that's you as a company that's in scope. Well, this also applies to your value chain. So all of your stakeholders, this includes your joint ventures, this includes your suppliers and your customers. And so as you think about that and your value chain being analyzed, you may not have a material impact on this particular supplier or material opportunity with this customer, but a smaller customer to you who is in scope to CSRD, you may be material to them, okay? And so they are actually going to be asking you and requiring third-party information to be included in the report that relates to you. So whether you're in scope or not, through your value chain, there is going to be information asked of you to address in-scope companies' reporting obligations. And I think it's a little bit complicated way to say that, but if you are doing business with anybody in the EU, whether it's a supplier or customer, in the years to come, there's a phase-in associated with this, but in the years to come, you will be asked for more and more third-party information, which is auditable, to be able to comply with whether it's your customers or suppliers or yourself, comply with the CSRD reporting obligations.
And number 5?
So this talks about who it applies to. And I think going back to your scoping analysis, which is really an ongoing assessment, a moving target, it only takes one large undertaking, is what it's called, with not very much turnover. So it was 150 million in consecutive 2 years to be part of general scoping under the CSRD. So that is significantly lower than the California laws that just come out. And that also, going back to who this applies to, it applies to public companies and private companies. So you do not need to have listed securities in the EU. It only takes one EU subsidiary. And so this is the part I think is surprising to people. You don't have to be that large of a company or have that large of a European division to actually be in scope and have these significant reporting obligations. So, the practical implications is you really have to be beyond this to really understand, whether you're in scope or not.
Yeah, I do think that'll surprise some companies. What about number 6?
So I think just going back to the US, so we're under a voluntary framework. So it's very common, I would say, that companies make a determination that it's difficult and expensive, or it would be inaccurate to report certain aspects of their operations in their sustainability report. So it's disclosed. This report only applies to US operations because there's immaterial operations somewhere else. Or this does not include our significant joint venture, something like that. What I think is surprising about the CSRD, or surprising to folks about the CSRD, is the parent level reporting covers your entire operation. So this is not only your EU operations, but your non-EU operations. And going to that double materiality standard, your value chain as well. So it's going to pick up things like joint ventures, even under equity reporting. Those type of things and the breadth of who it picks up, I think is very surprising to people.
Yeah, so it's not just the one EU subsidiary. It's once you're in under the framework, you're under the framework entirely.
If you're picked up, in the parent reporting scope.
What about number 7?
So really talking about, you're figuring out who's in scope and you're evaluating whether you're in scope. And so there's certain tests. So there's the turnover test, and also there's this aspect of employees. So for scoping, I would say what's surprising to me as a US practitioner, part-time employees and temporary workers are included in the calculation of the average number of employees for scoping purposes. So it gets a bit more complicated than that because the definition of employee would differ by member states. Okay, so engagement with your EU colleagues is so important. So just to give you an example of that, and even how the calculation works in terms of how you calculate the average number of employees will differ by member state. So as an example, in Germany, the average number of employees is calculated by adding the number of employees employed at the end of each fiscal quarter. So March 31st, June 30th, September 30th, December 31, and dividing by 4. So how you calculate your employees for your reporting could be very different from how the assessment is done on a country by country basis. So even determining your scoping is a significant exercise that has some unknowns going to that fluidity of the regulatory framework.
This is like pay ratio calculation complexity times 100. That's really tough
Yes.
to deal with all the different countries. Number 8.
So I would say like the last, 8, 9, and 10, I really have thought about in terms of things to be aware of and going to what's surprising. And in putting on your your US reporting hat, CSRD is really likely to accelerate many companies' current sustainability reporting timeline. And so what I mean by that is the CSRD contemplates that your CSRD reporting will go hand in hand. It's your non-financial reporting, but it goes hand in hand with your financial reporting and in the same document. So the luxury that some companies take, and I would now to say, okay, well, let me take some extra time and make sure that I have a complete report, that I have an audited report, or whatever assurance you're getting, that I have gotten those joint venture materials. So I have a complete report, and publishing it mid-year is not going to work anymore under CSRD. So, and I think it helps to just for a bit to understand what an annual report means in the EU. So if you think about like how we do franchise taxes, we in the United States do franchise taxes on a state-by-state basis. If you're familiar with the EU reporting, you're reporting actually by your member state in financial statements governed by that member state. And so in your annual report, which could include unconsolidated financials under a different financial reporting standard, you would be including your sustainability reporting. So the timing of that annual report is going to be governed by that member state and when you do your annual reporting. So it translates different into the annual reports in the United States. And so really it's to be determined on the non-EU parent company reporting, how that works with a public US company. Does it go in your glossy annual report or how that really works? So some of that's yet to be determined, and how the SEC is going to work with companies on that is yet to be determined. But I think it's helpful to understand what an annual report, what the EU is talking about when we're talking about an annual report.
Wow. Number 9.
Going back to surprising things, limited assurance is mandatory. So this is fundamentally different than what the current reporting regime is. So audit assurance was previously optional under the existing non-financial reporting directive, or NFRD. So it was optional. CSRD requires the entire report for all in-scope companies to have limited assurance. So set aside that I don't know where these auditors are coming from for the 50,000 new in-scope companies that are going to be subject to the CSRD. This is an extremely additional burden for companies to have assurance ready type reporting on an entity level basis, and taking it just one step further on that double materiality standard. Your assurance is based on your reporting, your assessment of materiality, which includes that third party disclosure. So it's quite an undertaking for the assurance. And just as a practice point, you have to remember when engaging assurance providers that the independence requirements are different and evolving in the EU. So it's not as much as you can grab the same person and it'll always work out that way. So it is quite an undertaking for the assurance side of this.
I hate to ask what number 10 is going to be. 8 and 9 are pretty big.
So I mentioned we're not going to talk about double materiality, but the last thing I will leave with is there was, going back to news and flashy headlines. So when the original first ESRS came out, many things were disclosable whether or not they were material. And so when the final ESRS came out this year, it was a positive shift from the draft framework, and many things were qualified by materiality, which is great. So in theory, that if you've gone through the undertaking of evaluating your impact and your risk and opportunities for your entire value chain through the double materiality standards, and you have evaluated that disclosure item is not material, excellent. You still have to explain why it's not material. And that itself, so as number 10, I would say that the surprising thing is the disclosure of what's not material from a financial and impact perspective, is still required to have assurance associated with it. A third party is coming in, your third party assurance provider, and actually, digging into your assessment of materiality. So it kind of leads itself to say, well, are we really just going to disclose everything unless it's really, really not material to our company? I think that's kind of a misconception in terms of, getting out of jail free card if something is not material. It's subject to third party scrutiny.
Yeah, it sounds like it will open the door to a lot of litigation, potentially if.
There's just there's so much unknown with respect to the framework and how this is going to work in practical terms, which goes back to why the EU gave the EFRAG a bit more time to see how the first ESRS plays out and what needs to be changed. But there's still quite a lot of disclosure that is going to be made for companies, even those that currently comply with the NFRD.
Well, it sounds like you're going to be extremely busy over the next 500 years. So thanks so much for spending your time and giving us your knowledge. And we will, if you're available, check in with you as things develop, Cynthia. Thanks so much.
Thank you.